I want to begin this lecture by introducing you to a friend of mine. This friend is Elvis the bacterium. Now, the reason I want to introduce you to my friend Elvis, this bacterial cell, is because Elvis is really, really good at doing something. Specifically, what Elvis is good at doing is reproducing itself. Now, as you know, when bacteria reproduce, essentially what they do is they just start with one cell and then they divide and produce two daughter cells. Now, if this bacterium, this single bacterium, were left to its own devices, in other words, if nothing got in the way of this bacterium I've called Elvis from preventing it from reproducing as much as it could, then the output of its reproduction would be truly astounding. Let's say this bacteria divided about once every 20 minutes, which is a realistic estimate for bacteria. And let's say we let this bacterium and all of its progeny, all of its descendants, continue to divide unimpeded at this rate for about 36 hours. In other words, from now until maybe tomorrow night. By that time, this single bacterium and all of its progeny would be so numerous that they would cover the entire surface of the planet Earth to a thickness of about a foot deep. And in fact, if we waited for a month, then the progeny of this one bacteria would be so numerous that they would weigh more than the entire known visible universe, and it would be expanding outward at the speed of light. As I said, this bacterium is very good at reproducing. Now, bacteria aren't the only organisms that are good at reproducing. Let me give you another textbook example. If we started with a single pair of cod, the food fish you find commonly in the Atlantic Ocean, for example, and we just had one pair, and we let that pair reproduce as much as it could, along with all of its offspring, in only 6 years, the descendants of that one pair would be so numerous that their bodies would fill the entire basin of the Atlantic Ocean. There would be no room for water. In fact, all organisms have this potential for explosive growth. Darwin recognized this fact, and in fact, he learned it from Malthus. Remember, Malthus was the economist who published an essay in 1798 in which he argued that the size of populations, the human population in specific, is limited by competition for food and other resources. Darwin wrote in his Origin of the Species, and I'm quoting here, "There is no exception to the rule that every organic being naturally increases at so high a rate that, if not destroyed, the earth would be soon covered by the progeny of a single pair." And of course, this potential for excess reproduction proved to be a key element in Darwin's theory of natural selection, you'll recall. But in general, and maybe fortunately, organisms usually don't exhibit this kind of growth, at least not for sustained periods of time. So why don't they? Why don't we have bacteria covering the entire surface of the earth and expanding outward? Well, to a first approximation, the answer to that question is simply because organisms don't have enough resources to allow them to reproduce that much. And this brings me back to the reason I wanted to introduce you to this bacterium in the first place. Why this bacterial cell doesn't in 36 hours cover the surface of the earth, or in a month fill the entire known space of the visible universe, in general, to a first approximation, is simply because it doesn't have enough to eat. Now, we've been focusing on energy at the cellular level for the last several lectures. What we want to do now is to extend our understanding of energy in biological systems to higher levels in the hierarchy of the organization of biology. We want to go from molecules and cells, where we've been up to this point, up to eventually the level of looking at the implications of energy for the entire biosphere, the whole planet. We want to ask questions like how organisms use energy and other resources across their lifetimes, how energy and other resources affect the distribution and abundance of populations of kinds of organisms, or how they affect the structure of communities of different species of organisms, and ultimately how they influence the structure of entire ecosystems. Our exploration of energy and resources in living systems at higher levels of biological organization will center around the issue of understanding how these resources are limiting and how these limitations influence organization of living systems. From the adaptations of organisms to maximize their ability to acquire and efficiently use such resources, up through the way that populations of a single species grow in response to such resources, communities of species are organized, and so forth. Now, before we go on, I need to expand our discussion just a little bit here. Just as when we were talking about the theme of information and evolution, we could use the molecule DNA as kind of a focus for our discussion, so too when we're talking about energy and resources, we can use this molecule we've discussed, ATP, as a kind of conceptual focus. Indeed, all work done in biological systems, and this includes the development of and maintenance of order, of higher levels of organization and so forth, all of this is ultimately powered by the energy that's stored in ATP. And as we've seen, ultimately all of this energy is derived from sunlight. However, we have to realize that ATP alone can't be the sole focus of our story. The energy that's stored in ATP is really just one of many resources that could potentially influence the way that organisms grow, survive, and reproduce. To be sure, energy in the form of ATP is an enormously important resource, but organisms don't live by ATP alone. There are other things that could be essentially just as limiting for life. Now, let me clarify this point by putting it into a context for you. Remember, we discussed how energy flows into living systems on the planet, ultimately coming from sunlight. Light reactions of photosynthesis capture this energy. The dark reactions, or the Calvin cycle, take this energy and use it to build high-energy organic compounds. Photosynthesis uses as its raw materials, we know, carbon dioxide and water, and of course it needs a supply of energy from sunlight. Now, the carbon that is produced by photosynthesis has two fates, again, as we mentioned last time. First, the organic compounds that are produced by carbon fixation in the Calvin cycle may be used by the organism that actually fixes that carbon as a source of energy. For example, taking the G3P that's produced and feeding it back into the glycolytic pathway, and in so doing, producing more ATP that organism can use to power its own cellular processes. In fact, on average, about 90% of the G3P that's produced by the Calvin cycle for a particular organism has this fate. About 90% is just simply cycled off and used to make more ATP. Now, alternatively, the organic carbon that's produced by the Calvin cycle might actually be used as a starting point for building other biomolecules, more complex biomolecules. And in this way, the carbon that's fixed by photosynthesis essentially ends up becoming the stuff that organisms are made of, the stuff that the photosynthetic organism builds itself out of. This stuff is what we call biomass in general, and about 10% of the G3P, about roughly 10% of the G3P that's produced by the Calvin cycle ends up making more of the stuff of the organism that produced it. Now, you might guess from this summary then that what limits the growth of living systems is the energy in sunlight, potentially, of course, which is unlimited as long as the sun is shining, and also the amount of carbon dioxide and water that's available, because we know we need those as raw materials for photosynthesis. But life isn't that simple. Don't forget that organic molecules, although they're made of a lot of carbon and oxygen and hydrogen, which we can get from with carbon dioxide and water, they also include a number of other elements. Some of these are as important as the carbon and oxygen and hydrogen. For example, nitrogen is an element that's found in amino acids. Now, all amino acids need nitrogen, and of course amino acids are what make up proteins. Phosphorus is a key element involved in nucleic acids and derivatives of nucleotides such as the ATP that we've been talking about. So we can't make these molecules without a supply of phosphorus. Sulfur is an element that is very commonly found, or that is found in two very critical amino acids, cysteine and methionine. So there are elements like this that are just very commonly found in the biomolecules that we're made of. In addition, there are many, many other elements that occur much more rarely or are found in much less quantity in living systems, but nonetheless are essential. An example of this is magnesium. We saw how magnesium, a single atom of magnesium, is at the center of the head of every chlorophyll molecule. We don't have magnesium, we can't have chlorophyll, and we can't have life. Now, other kinds of elements may not necessarily be incorporated directly into biomolecules, but nonetheless play an essential role in life. For example, we saw how potassium is a critical element found in the cytoplasm of cells and in the extracellular fluids surrounding cells, critical element that determines the electrical charge of cells, and, for example, the way that neurons can fire and so forth. Now, we could list many, many other kinds of elements here, but the general point is that there are all sorts of stuff that organisms are made of or that they need to function properly that they have to acquire, and if they don't acquire this, these other elements can be just as limiting to the growth of and reproduction of those organisms. Okay, this is the problem. Organisms need all of these different things to grow and reproduce. And in general, there is not enough of this stuff to go around. Not only is it possible for energy to be limiting as organisms grow and develop, but it's possible for any number of other kinds of materials or elements that they need to incorporate to be limiting as well. And this actually simplifies the system, or simplifies the situation as well, because there are other more complex factors that will determine whether a particular kind of organism can grow and reproduce adequately. All sorts of factors which could potentially limit the growth and reproduction of an organism. Now, what the implication of this is, the limitation, the potential limitation of energy and other resources for organisms, is that it's important to understand where an organism lives, or what other organisms live around a particular organism we're interested in, or how organisms interact with each other. And the reason it's important to understand this is because these kinds of factors play a major role in determining whether resources will be available to an organism or not. Where an organism lives will determine whether certain resources are available, depending on what's available at that particular place. How organisms interact with each other will determine the amount to which different organisms can take advantage of the resources that are available, and so forth. In the most general terms, we refer to the interactions of organisms with each other and with their environment as the ecology of organisms. In fact, one of the key questions that defines the field of ecology is to account for the abundance and distribution of different kinds of organisms, and patterns of abundance and distribution largely have to do with patterns of resource availability and how resources are used by different organisms. This means that as we begin to look at the implications of energy and resources at higher levels of biological organization, beyond the level of molecules and cells, what we're really doing is beginning to explore the area of biology known as ecology. Well, I want to begin this exploration of higher levels, this exploration of the ecological implications of energy and resources, by looking at how individual organisms, one individual organism, might use the resources that it happens to have available to it for its own growth and survival and reproduction. Now, remember in the very beginning of the course, in the first third of the course, we defined Darwinian fitness in terms of the ability of individuals in a population to reproduce relative to the other individuals in that population. In other words, we said that more fit individuals were individuals that reproduce more in an environment relative to the other individuals in its population. It takes energy and resources, however, to reproduce. So we would expect then that adaptations, those adaptations we talked about in the first third of the course when we were talking about evolution, largely have to do with the ability of organisms to gain resources from their environment, to compete with resources, to maximize the use of the resources that are available to them. So energy and resources then begin to tell us something about how we can think about adaptation. But organisms don't necessarily take all of the resources that they have available to them and just devote them to the production of more offspring. Some of the resources that an individual organism takes in, it has to use for other purposes. Obviously, it has to use these resources for itself, for its own growth. It has to use these resources for its own maintenance. In other words, the ability of it to just simply maintain its current homeostatic status. So the point here is that regardless of how many resources a particular individual organism, how much resource a particular individual organism is able to require, it's also important to consider how an individual organism allocates the resources it does have available to these different kinds of needs. Now, the way that an individual organism might allocate resources available to it will differ among different kinds of organisms. Different species will use organisms in different ways. And even the same species will use the resources available to it differently during different stages of its lifespan. A particular kind of organism's pattern of resource utilization, the way it allocates the resources it has available to it across its lifespan, traits that ultimately affect how long it lives, how many offspring it produces, and so forth, we refer to this pattern as an organism's life history. Now, it's convenient to think of dividing the life history of a particular organism into different stages that are characterized by differing patterns of the acquisition and allocation of resources. And because of this, we often define particular stages specifically in terms of patterns of resource use. To make this point about life histories clear, let's consider aspects of the life histories of four very, very different kinds of organisms. Let's consider the life histories of a tree, of a marmot. This is a kind of large ground squirrel, of a salmon, of a common fish, and of a moth, an insect. Now, let's first ask how organisms like these might differ in the way that they actually obtain resources, their pattern of resource acquisition. Now, you might guess that all organisms actually are always going to be gathering energy and resources. And this is true for some organisms, but not for all. For example, a tree, assuming that it's not a deciduous tree, a tree that keeps its leaves all year long, will in fact always be gaining more resources, in this case from its own photosynthesis. But some organisms will only acquire energy and other resources during particular parts of their life history. They actually devote particular parts of the life history, parts of their lifespan specifically just to gaining resources. For example, many species of moths will only feed when they're caterpillars, only when they're in their young juvenile form. And then when they turn into adults, they might even entirely lack mouth parts and stop feeding altogether. So in this case, this particular kind of organism has devoted a particular early period of life to just gathering resources. Similarly, some species of mammals, like these marmots I mentioned, actually will hibernate for several months. And during this period of hibernation, they don't acquire any new resources. They essentially shut most of their physiological systems down to a very low level and survive on whatever resources they've acquired up to that point. So they will only acquire resources during particular times of the year. Now, for most life histories, we also would be able to identify particular stages that we associate with growth. In some cases, such as ourselves or many kinds of mammals like the marmot or the moth, an insect, the growth stage of a life history is confined to an early period of life. For example, in the case of a marmot, a mammal like a marmot, the young will grow quite a bit, and then once it reaches an adult stage after a year or two, for the case of a marmot, then the animal stays more or less the same size. In other organisms, however, energy devoted to growth will continue throughout life. This would be true, for example, of a tree, which continues growing, or even some organisms, some animals like the salmon, a fish, which will more or less continue to grow throughout its lifetime. Now, for most life histories, we also see that resources will have to be devoted to what we've called maintenance during periods of the lifespan. Maintenance refers to the amount of the resources an animal has available to it that it needs merely to stay alive, essentially to perform its normal physiological functioning. Essentially, the resources devoted to maintenance are the cost an animal pays for homeostasis. Now, maintenance in one form or another occurs throughout most of the lifetime of many organisms, but for sometimes organisms will go through periods where all they do is maintenance. For example, when the marmot is hibernating, the only thing it's doing is maintaining itself. Conversely, we have organisms like a salmon, which simply stop putting any resources into maintenance at the very end of their life, because at that point they're devoting all of their energy and resources just to reproduction. Well, finally, and most importantly, all resources include a phase during which, all life histories, I should say, include a phase during which resources are specifically devoted to the task of reproduction. In some cases, reproduction only occurs once, for example, near the end of the life history, such as in the case of a moth or a salmon, which only as older adults will finally reproduce just before they die. In other cases, reproduction can occur at repeated intervals. For example, we would see that with something like a tree, which is going to be producing young every year, or a mammal like a marmot, which might produce a young in every yearly cycle. Now, the examples of different organisms I've chosen to illustrate life history stages is really a pretty offhand assortment. But the point here is simply that life histories can vary dramatically among organisms. Different kinds of organisms use resources available to them in different ways, and in different ways in different parts of their lifespan. Furthermore, this variation among species in patterns of life history reflects the action of natural selection, with each life history presumably reflecting a strategy for maximizing reproductive output across an individual's lifetime. That is, maximizing reproduction by selecting for different patterns and timings of how resources are used. Now, the fact that an organism must divide up the total amount of energy and resources it has available to it among different life history needs leads to an important consequence. And this consequence is that we often see what we refer to as life history trade-offs in how resources are allocated in different stages of a life history. Now, if we were to imagine a hypothetical life history that would yield the greatest lifetime reproductive output, we might imagine individuals that, once they're able to reproduce, begin reproducing as early as possible, reproduce as much as possible, and as often as possible. But clearly, if individuals are putting all of their energy into reproduction, then they can't put that energy and resources into other things that they need to do, such as maintaining themselves or growing. So what that means is that we commonly observe a trade-off between the amount of resource that's put into reproduction and other aspects of an organism's life history. Let me give you an example of this. This example comes from a pattern that we would observe if we looked at the relationship between the amount of resource that is typically put into reproduction on an annual basis and the long-term survival of a species. So, for example, if you consider some group of organisms, birds for example, what you see is that different species will devote different amounts of energy and resource to reproduction on an annual basis. For example, we have some species, like tree swallows are an example, which actually reproduce a lot every year. A typical tree swallow female will produce a clutch, that's a group of eggs, of about 5 or 6 eggs every year. On the other hand, we have other species. An albatross might be an example of this. An albatross is a pelagic, a seagoing bird, that actually might only produce a single egg once every 5 years. Now, clearly, the tree swallow is investing a lot of energy and resource into reproduction on an annual basis as compared to the albatross, which is hanging back and actually not devoting very much energy and resource into reproduction. Now, what's interesting is if we then look at other aspects of life history of these kinds of species. And specifically, if we looked at the lifespan of these species, we'd see a very interesting pattern there as well. Now, the way we might look at this is, for example, for each species, we have tree swallows on one end of the spectrum, albatrosses on the other end of the spectrum, and you can imagine there are all sorts of species in between that vary in the amount that they reproduce every year. If we plotted these species on a graph that had as its x-axis some measure of lifespan, so for example, we could use the annual likelihood that an individual will die, right, its mortality rate, and the higher the mortality rate, what that means is the shorter your lifespan because you're less likely to survive to the next year. And then we plot on the y-axis what the annual number of offspring produced are, what we would call the fecundity of that species. What we would see is that the tree swallow, while it reproduces a lot every year, actually has a very high probability of dying every year. It has a shorter lifespan. Whereas the albatross, which reproduces relatively little on an annual basis, can actually live for many, many years. This is an example of a life history trade-off, and specifically a trade-off between reproduction and other aspects of life history, for example, the amount of resource that's necessary just for maintenance. The tree swallow puts a lot of energy and resource into reproduction, but at the cost of putting less, presumably, into maintenance, and therefore at the cost of living less long. The albatross puts less energy into reproduction every year, but then and produces fewer offspring, but at the benefit of being more likely to live to the next year and potentially living for a very long time. Now, here's a key question to ask. Who's doing better here? The tree swallow or the albatross? The tree swallow is reproducing a lot, and that would seem, from a Darwinian point of view, to be a good thing, and the albatross isn't reproducing very much. On the other hand, a tree swallow might only live for 3 or 4 years most. So although it produces a lot every year, it doesn't have very long to do that. Whereas the albatross can live for many, many years. It doesn't reproduce a lot, but it has a long time to do so. The point is that the essence of the trade-off is not that one approach, one strategy is better than the other, but that they represent two different ways to maximize reproductive success. Put a lot of energy into reproduction now at the cost of dying young, or put less energy into reproduction on an annual basis with the benefit of living longer so that maybe over the long run you produce a lot of offspring. There are many other kinds of life history trade-offs that you can observe, mostly involving trade-offs between reproduction and some other aspect of an organism's biology. Another common trade-off, for example, is a trade-off between how young an organism is when it first starts to reproduce and how long it lives. And in general, I won't go into the details here, you can see this for many, many different groups of species. Species that start reproducing at a younger age will live less long. Why? For the same reason. Because they've started to invest into reproduction, invest in reproduction early, they have less that they can put into maintenance, and they're more likely to have a shortened lifespan. Again, it's an example of alternative ways to maximize reproductive success. Those organisms that are reproducing young may not live as long, but their own offspring are being added to the population sooner. And their own offspring can start to themselves reproduce and themselves produce more offspring. Whereas organisms that reproduce later are essentially only adding their own genes to the gene pool at a later point, and thus not necessarily doing better just because they live longer. Well, in today's lecture, we've considered the issue of how an individual organism must allocate the energy and resources it has available to it, ultimately to maximize its own reproduction, but potentially in very different ways, putting energy and resources into one life history trait or the other, with different kinds of trade-offs representing different ways to maximize reproductive success. The fact that any individual will only have a finite amount of resources available is why we have life history trade-offs. There's not enough to go around even within a single organism, even from the point of view of a single organism. If we had time, we could explore similar life history trade-offs involving, for example, the allocation of resources to development or to other life history parameters. One take-home message here is that many of the adaptations we see in organisms, including patterns of how organisms grow, or the timing of their reproduction, or the rate at which they reproduce, as well as many aspects of the physiology and anatomy and behavior of organisms, all reflect the existence of these life history trade-offs, ways of making the best of a limited amount of resources. Ultimately, the nature of these trade-offs is determined by the energy and resources that are available to an organism, which is in turn determined by where it lives, who it interacts with, how it interacts with other organisms, and so forth. Well, now that we've looked at some of the patterns that underlie the diversity of life histories observed for individual organisms, what we're going to want to do is turn next to the question of how energy and resources influence the growth, or I should say the change of the structure and growth of populations of organisms of the same kind. And that's the point that we'll return to in our next lecture.